Hi, Chelsea.
Hi, Diane. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming to the Lit Garden Author Series. I'm really looking forward to talking with you today. I'd like to share with our listeners a little bit about you. So, Chelsea Bieker is the award winning author of Madwoman, a national bestseller named a Book of the Month pick and praised by the New York Times for its depiction of the long shadows cast by domestic violence. Her previous works include Godshot and the story collection Heartbroke, both critically acclaimed and honored by outlets like NPR, Oprah Daily, and Elle. Her writing has appeared in the Paris Review, People, The Cut, and more. Raised in Hawaii and California, Chelsea now lives in Portland, Oregon, where she co-created The Fountain and writes about the creative life on her Substack, Make Up Your Life. Welcome, Chelsea.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here and I can't wait to talk to you today.
Yeah, me too. I'm really looking forward to talking with you. I just loved your book. Congratulations. You must be thrilled it's out in the world.
I am, yes. I'm very excited and I just received your beautiful book in the mail. So thank you so much for that.
Yes, you're welcome. I'm always curious when I speak with authors to find out what was the spark, what was the genesis for the novel, and how long did you need to let it percolate before you actually sat down to start writing it?
Yeah, it's really interesting because after I wrote it, I stumbled upon some of my very early writing that I was doing kind of in my early 20s, maybe even sooner than that, where I was writing these sort of snippets that were addressed to M, which I was writing like, "Dear M, love C. Dear C, love M." And it was this correspondence between sort of a fictionalized version of me and my mom. And finding that, I realized that I think I've been trying to write something like this for a very long time, and it's always been there. And once I started writing Madwoman and I realized it was this direct address to her mother, it felt very natural to do it that way because I think I had been kind of knocking at that door for a long time. It's really born out of, I think, my long held desire of a true connection with my own mother and sort of the space and time to be heard by one another that I think we never truly got, just that sort of unfettered connection. And so it was really my exploration, and it felt like this very urgent desire to write a character who was communicating with her mother in this sort of uninterrupted way. It's sort of this moment where finally they're not going to be interrupted by a man or, a situation. It's this long form sort of telling and explanation and request. And I love that urgency that comes with that direct address and sort of the way it feels to read that. I'm so attracted to feeling like I'm overhearing a conversation or reading a letter and not really supposed to be privy to that information. It feels so exciting. And then I wanted to also write a novel about motherhood as I was sort of experiencing early motherhood. And naturally, I found very quickly that those two things were going to be connected. I wasn't going to write a separate novel, like a funny novel about motherhood that didn't entertain the fact of sort of my mother's experience mothering me. So they just became really quickly entwined.
Well, you dedicate the book to your mom. And the first sentence in the book is this just grabbed me right off the bat. The world is not made for mothers. You obviously address that notion throughout the book, and then you repeat, I think almost verbatim, that sentence near the end of the book. So obviously, although there's so much going on in the book in terms of big issues, the whole notion of mothers existing in the world and how we do that and how we perceive our own mothers doing that was a very interesting idea to me. And I love the idea of writing a letter. My mom's not with me anymore. And I've often thought, if I could just call her or if I could just write, I'd love to tell her this. I'd love to tell her about this. And you did it.
Yeah, I think that with fiction, it offers us this opportunity to write into kind of what I think about as this term personal fantasy. It's like that's a personal fantasy of mine, is to be able to communicate with my mother in that way and be heard. And, my mother's also passed away. It's not possible in the traditional sense, but yet it is something we can do in fiction. And we can have conversations in fiction that we can't have in real life. And we can see different forms of justice take place that we can't see in real life. And that's so attractive to me as an artist, that through this act of creation, we kind of do get to experience the things that we might be yearning to experience in some form. So, in many ways, this book was really tapping into that for me, for sure.
I love that notion of emotional justice. I'd never heard that term before. And I also love the notion of how memoir and fiction can coexist, maybe cross over in different ways, but they're separate spheres, and how a truth can be told in a story that maybe can't be told in quite the same way in a memoir. Did you find that to be the case writing this book?
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, I've always been able to access a much deeper layer of emotional truth for myself through fiction, which is interesting. I mean, for my whole life, people have said, oh, you should write a memoir. But every time I've sat down to write my experiences in a more straight form way, just as memoir, I am not as engaged in that process for some reason. Like I enjoy writing essays. Sometimes that is the best way to get something across, but I also find the freedom of fiction allows me to almost like cut through some of my own barriers and get to something that is ultimately a bit truer for me on that emotional sphere. So the action of the book, the things that are actually happening in the plot may not have happened to me or in my life, but they do feel like echoes of the truth, or they are using fictional forms to get closer to the impact of how the truth felt for the reader. I think that's what plot can do. It's like we can use these really wild plots to allow a reader to really inhabit how something felt in real life, even if the real life version maybe wasn't so exciting or action packed. And I love that. I love that so much. And it does give me this freedom that I think for me echoes the way memory has worked in my own life, where memory is not always available to me. And knowing that there's many blank spots for me just because of the way the brain fractures memory in traumatic events, I get to just let that go, like that need to tell the truth and be accurate. I can let that go and sub in this whole other world that's kind of accessing the felt memory or that emotional memory.
Because someone said this to me once. I'm not sure that it happened this way, but I know this story is true. And I feel that fiction allows us to do that. In a memoir, others who were there are still around. And then you start worrying, well, wait a second, was that the year I was in seventh grade? Or, do I need to get all these details accurate? And you worry, I mean, for me, I worry about hurting somebody's feelings or revealing something they don't want revealed. And when you transform it to fiction, you can put any crazy thing in there you want and still get at the nugget of the truth that you're dying to tell the world about.
Absolutely. Actually, I was thinking, I think it's attributed to Anne Patchett's mother. She says, none of it happened, but all of it's true. And when I read that, I said, yes, that's exactly how I think of fiction. Maybe none of this happened, but all of it feels true.
One of the things I loved about the book, and I think this must have been pretty tough, is you not only have a lot of different timelines and a lot of different settings, but your characters actually assume different identities throughout these timelines and settings, which is an interesting way of exploring what identity and character means. But I think as a writer, was that tough to keep to keep all that straight?
Well, I think that at first, when I started writing it, I didn't know that I would be doing that. Like, the first few drafts are actually quite different than what ended up coming out. And I just found a notebook the other day that where it kind of was me chronicling some of how I was working out some of the plot connections and some of the twists that end up coming, because at first they weren't really there. It was sort of this thing that as I got deeper and deeper into the process, those connections started becoming apparent. And it was actually really fun because I remember one night just sort of like waking up from this dream and I was like, I know what's going to happen. Or like that feeling of like, oh, of course, those things are actually connected. Or that person is actually, you know, not who they seem. Also, it's that desire, I think, too, when you're revising, or at least I try to do this, is trying to compress as much as possible. Sometimes characters fall away during that process, and sometimes places might fall away, or maybe a place is utilized in new ways because you want to kind of have that compressive power to the book. And it was kind of in that part, that final stretch of writing it, where a lot of those things came into mind for me. Sometimes I'm really amazed by the way writers live because our brains are holding the existence of our really lived world. And then also we're managing the world of the books we're writing, which is has its own laws and its own, it's so much to hold. But I do think it was like a chipping away process. So I certainly didn't like come into it knowing I would be doing all of that, which probably makes it manageable.
Yes, I suppose, because it's both maybe both chipping away and building up, creating the sculpture with the words of the story. Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense to me. As far as the living with the real life and the stories that we're making up, I don't know about you, but for me, when I'm writing, those people are just as real to me as my own family, my own friends. So, in a way, it's crazy to carry them around, but on the other hand, why wouldn't I? I know a lot of people. These are just people I know too. The fact that I'm the fact that I'm inventing, well, let me ask you about this. We do invent our characters and we can control them. We can decide who's going to go fall away and who's going to be involved. But on the other hand, once they've really grabbed a hold of us, don't they also sometimes have a say in what their role in the story is going to be?
Absolutely. I think you're just naming the sort of magic alchemical process that occurs when we're writing that is hard to explain. And it does feel like a channeling of sorts that isn't necessarily happening in our conscious awareness. I mean, that's when things get good because you're like, I'm just sort of reporting back. I don't know where a lot of this is coming from. And obviously, it's coming from those deeper unconscious layers of us and our experiences and the way that those characters are starting to access some of that. I love to think of it as magic because I think that's why people love to write when you can access that feeling. And there's this quote, and I'll totally butcher it now, but I used to have it above my desk, and it was something to the effect of a story is not done until it turns around and like glowers back at you, or like, that sort of idea that it becomes its own thing and you are not in control, really. That's how I think of art, at least. I mean, I could never probably totally plot out my story ahead of time. I think that there's so much discovery that happens in the act of writing. So I love that part.
Yeah, I love that part too, and I 100% agree with you. Sometimes people ask me, "Did you know how your book was going to end when you started it?" Well, kind of course, because, you have a general idea. But there were things that happened along the way that I didn't foresee, and I didn't really want to have happen, to be perfectly honest. There were a couple things I thought, no, I don't want to put this in here, but it needed to go in there. It had to go in there. And I was thinking about your book, how it's both very funny and also deals with really serious, challenging topics. And I was telling someone, I said, "Oh, it's both funny and really and serious. You're really going to like it." And she said, "How could an author write a book that's both funny and serious at the same time?" And it was a hard question to answer, but I think in part you've just answered that, right? The story is both and all.
Yeah, I think very rarely in life are we experiencing something on only one register. Like even in some of my darkest times, there can still be a comedy involved. There can still be an irony happening, or it doesn't mean you shut that totally off. You also still need to like eat lunch. That's so much of what having children was sort of like for me, where I would be having to kind of navigate really tricky terrain involving, for example, my ailing alcoholic parents, what to do about their care. Like there would be these ways that I would be stepping into that world. And also at the same time, my kids are needing me to like open a popsicle. It doesn't stop. Those two things are always happening at once. And you just have to like pause and open the popsicle and then go on with I just found that fracturing of self in motherhood so obvious. But I think that fracturing is always happening in life. And also, I do think in writing, I think that the comedy is relief. If there was no comedy in this book, I know that it would be a very dark, difficult read. And I think it's best to have that texture because it is not only more true to life, but also it's true to how I see the world at the same time, and it's true to my sense of humor. And I think it humanizes all of it. Where if a reader has not experienced, say, like domestic violence, they still understand what it's like to find something funny or ironic, or, they can still step into that character and feel related.
I think so too. And I think for Clove, and probably for all of us, her humor is also a bit of a defense mechanism. She's so witty and she's so clever, and she pulls out her ridiculousness whenever she needs it. It's a way that she copes with the popsicle and the ailing parents, all the things happening at the same time. I really appreciated that. I can't take an unrelenting onslaught of doom and gloom. It's not realistic for one thing, and it's very hard to enjoy.
Yeah, and it's a great way to kind of alienate the reader and not not really get that topic, not allowing them to engage with that topic. And I think the topics in the book are really important to me. And so that's not what I think of as I'm writing, but it's like later in the process, I am aware of that, that desire to connect with people around certain topics and knowing that that's always better done by taking this more like human road.
I thought the relationship between Clove and her father was a very tricky one to write about. And I thought the way you wrote about it was quite realistic. I have not lived through that experience, so I don't know exactly what that's like from my own life. But after reading the book, I feel that I do know how it probably is for most people. And I think that must have been hard. Was that hard for you to write that relationship?
Yeah, I think that was one of the trickier relationships in the book and something that I had to keep coming back to in revision to get right. And there was one scene that I knew needed to be there, but for a very long time, I couldn't really write it. I just wasn't really ready. And I didn't really know what exactly it should be or what should be said. And I just had like a TK there for so long, and finally, when I accessed it, it was definitely probably the most difficult scene in the book to write because it was important to me to preserve their connection. I mean, she did love her father. It's so much more complicated to write that than to write him just as a villain.
Absolutely.
And I have yet to meet someone who is 100% a villain, right? It's like there is always a reason. I'm interested in those generational reasons why people end up repeating patterns or becoming the very thing they wish that they would not. And I did want to make that clear in the book. The father, has a complicated story of his own, and yet I didn't want to give too much page time to that because I didn't want to seem like I was condoning his violence in any way, but I did want to nod to this sort of generational system.
I think you did that really well. Generational trauma is something that's very interesting to me too. It's inevitable. I mean, we like to think that there will be some magic way to stop it, that, it ends with us. I will never do this, say this, react this way. But we all do. We all watch ourselves doing certain things that we swore we'd never do. And it's so interesting to me why these things get baked in, even though our consciousness is saying, no, I reject this ingredient. I'm not taking this on.
Yeah, it takes a real concentrated effort. And I wanted to show like what does that look like, you know? How does this woman who really doesn't have many tools from her upbringing then create this life that is very different. And she is doing it, but she's also suffering inside a lot, and it's like, I just wanted to write a book that showed the way trauma looks in the day to day. And that was something I was exploring for myself. What does it mean to have seen the things I've seen, to have gone through what I've gone through? Because you can be in your waking life, and your waking life is quite normal, and no one would know looking at you those things. And yet they are this sort of ghost in the nursery type things. I just felt like so much of that came up for me in those postpartum years. And it felt so palpable to me. I was like, how do I make memory feel frightening on the page? Because memory felt very scary to me for a long time, and even still does at times, because there's so much that is not quite known, or there's so much that feels really awful to carry. And so what does it look like to heal that, or to move through that, and also parent at the same time? There's not like an easy answer, right? It's like the book doesn't necessarily offer an easy answer, but if there was one, I think it's that the inquiry and the confrontation head on is usually the way forward.
I loved how Clove decided to tell her story. I thought that was really well done and quite realistic. And I think maybe the way most of us get to the point where we can tell our story and face our memories. So well done, you. I wanted to ask a little bit about your general writing process. Now this is your third book, right? So have you followed the same general pattern for each of your books?
That's a good question. I mean, it's funny because I wrote the first two at the same time, because one of them is a short story collection and one is a novel. And I was writing these short stories when I would take a break from the novel. It almost as like this way to just do something else. And by the end of the process, I realized I actually had two books that had come out of this period. And they feel like they're kind of like cousins. They're like holding hands. They are connected thematically. There are some crossover characters. It was definitely like two books born of the same world. And so that was a unique experience, I think. But when I wrote Madwoman, I think the big thing that felt different was just that I knew I could do it. Like I had done it before, and so I knew I could do it again. And they were really different books, but yet I think just that baseline of knowing, okay, I can get to the end of this, I know I can do it, was helpful. And the process felt shorter because of that. And because I had just grown as a writer through writing those other books, I had more confidence when I wrote Madwoman, and that story poured out pretty quickly, actually. I think it was about a 3-year process. So for me, that feels fast. And now the book I'm writing now feels very different from those books. And I do think there is, with each new book, there's a new set of requirements of us as an artist that will be revealed in the process. And that's where I am now, where I know I'm stretching my own limits with what I can do. And that's what I want to be doing. And yet the work is still all connected. Someone said this, it was funny one time. They were like, if there was a Chelsea Bieker theme park, what would it be like? And I was like, well, it would be terrifying. First of all, I would never go to that. But yeah, I always say like, well, all of them exist within this theme park of my mind. So the process looks a bit different. I think the book I'm writing now, what I'm sensing is that it's requiring a real, like, deeper concentration almost. Maybe that sounds weird. Like, I was concentrating for the first three, but this one is asking more of me on every level. And I'm still trying to articulate exactly what that's about, but it feels like it's a bigger animal or something. Like I keep picturing this like giant animal that I'm trying to rein in, and I need like a bigger cage for it. I need new equipment or something.
I was on a panel with an author once who said, you learn how to write a novel by writing a novel. You learn how to write the next novel by writing that novel. I think that's true. And, I'm working on my next book. What you just said about the big animal is definitely the case for me. I've set myself a task that quite often when I sit down to write, I think, can you do this? Can you pull this off? But I don't know about you. I feel like, well, why not try? If I can't make it work, I can try a different approach. That's why we try to create, isn't it?
I don't think it's ever random that we have these impulses. I really trust the impulse and I don't question it. That's one thing that I always tell any of my clients or writing students is like, It's actually really not random that you have the urge to write this specific thing. I think that you have to listen to that. I just have always really trusted that, those impulses in myself, and followed them, even when they're inconvenient, even when they require like a big rewrite or, because once you know that's the case, you can't unhear it. You know that it has to happen. That's the feeling of inevitability that is really cool, I think.
I'm writing about addiction right now. I don't really know much about addiction, but so I'm having to do a lot of research. I had to abandon one line of thought because it was too upsetting to me. I didn't expect that, but I just couldn't handle it. Otherwise, it's a ton of research. And that's one of the things I think, why did you decide to write about this? You don't know anything about this. But I'm learning a lot about this. And as I'm learning about it, Chelsea, I'm finding out I do know something about this. There is a reason I need to write about this that I was not aware of until I started the book. So, to your point, it has to be.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I've learned a lot about myself in realizing what I already wrote. The themes that resurface in my work, I was not always conscious of where they were coming from. And it's been this long process of realizing, of course, I was exploring that theme, or of course, I was circling that again and again, because that's in me. That's in my brain trying to work it out and trying to figure it out for myself. It's not coming from nowhere. These are things of our hearts that we're called to explore for a reason.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Do you read other fiction while you're writing your own fiction?
Yeah, I do. I don't feel that other voices impact me all that much. Like, I know that for some writers, they like to keep that separate or something, and I don't necessarily feel that way, or I haven't. In fact, I like to find books that feel like what I call North Star books while I'm working, and I just really keep reading those. I like the books I'm reading to feel connected in some way to what I'm writing when I'm in that deep writing process. And actually, the book I'm writing now, a lot of what I am reading has ended up being nonfiction. It's just the topic of the book has sort of required that curiosity in that direction. But yeah, I don't know. I'm a real proponent for just reading whatever I want.
Me too. How do you balance? I mean, you're very busy. How do you balance children, teaching writing, promoting a book? Probably you eat very healthily because you know a lot about health food. How do you how do you keep all those plates in the air?
I mean, that's a good question. I think right now, I feel like I'm not doing the best job at keeping the plates in the air. I feel like summer always catches me by surprise, where summer is its own time that requires a lot more time with the kids and like doing activities with them, which is so fun. And also, something I've realized for this book is that because I really am requiring this very deep concentration, I've started getting up really early in the morning to write before my kids wake up, which I've never done before because I never could do it before because I was so sleep deprived and still getting woken up in the middle of the night. There was no way I was going to wake up at 5:30. That would have been absolute death to me. But I've just started getting into a place where I kind of sometimes can do that and it feels pretty good. So I'm experimenting now. I like to reevaluate often what is working for me now because what worked for me 6 months ago has changed already. And I need to always inquire, okay, what is it going to look like this summer? What is it going to look like this fall? And just moving with that fluidly is important. And knowing that some seasons are just going to be more writing heavy and really trying to just hold a lot of grace for that because if you don't, there's no quicker way to kind of like block yourself off from the work altogether. I think it is about that constant evaluation and also creating a life where it takes a lot of forethought, right? It takes pre-planning. It takes intentional conversations with your family to be like, this is what I'm doing. And this is the way that I would love to be supported in that. And, so that soon everyone in your life kind of knows that is your thing. That's what you're doing. You're writing a book. And I just find that that can help. And by now, it's like my family they know. They know what I love to do. It doesn't mean that they're not going to interrupt me, but it's sort of a day-to-day recommitment to myself to just touch the work in some way, even if that's just like thinking about it.
Sometimes thinking about it is enough. I know people say they sit down and write every single day. I don't write every single day, but I have to have time to think about it. I find if I just sit down and just start typing, I don't like what comes out from that. I mean, I have words on a page, but most of the time I don't like those words.
Yeah, we need that time to contemplate and to find connections and to get sparks of inspiration. And the way we do that is through intention, right? It's like if you're gonna take a walk and listen to music that feels like it's connected to your book and just allow yourself to kind of daydream. I wrote so much of Madwoman walking in my head. And then I would grab my tape recorder and be like, this is what happens when, and it makes sense to me because that's a very meditative space, but it can look like so many different things, and often it doesn't actually look like a body at the keyboard. So it's good to remember that.
When I get to speak with authors, I always like to ask, if you could design your perfect day, what would your perfect day look like?
Oh my gosh. Okay. I think I would wake up really early before my family and I would write for 2 hours. Then I would get up and, make breakfast, spend time with them, maybe go for a long walk. A perfect day would involve perhaps lying on the grass. I really like to just like spend time lying on the grass. So, yeah, so it's probably kind of sunny and warm outside, ideally. Maybe there's some sort of swimming involved. I really love to be in water or around water, and there would be reading involved. It's not that exciting. Those are the simple things I think that now in my life I just know are the best things. One of my favorite feelings is, which doesn't happen much, is when I'm reading a book and my kids are also reading a book in the same room. It feels like we're together, but we're in our own like realms. It's really sweet. It's hardly ever happens. Don't worry. Don't get a fantasy version of my life. But yeah, it would be something to do with that. And just sort of like going in and out of my work, being in conversation with the work all day and in that way that doesn't feel like so pressurized or difficult. And then I don't know, there'd probably be like a delicious dinner involved or something. But really just I think what I know deep inside at this point in my life is that the moments I spend with my kids and my husband and the moments I spend engaging in the work, that is time I will never feel like I spent incorrectly. And so I don't know. I guess my perfect day has something to do with that in a body of water.
Well, Chelsea, it was just absolutely wonderful to talk with you. Thank you so much for being here today.
It was so wonderful to talk to you, Diane, and really amazing to connect with you. And I can't wait to read your book. And thank you for having me. It's really a joy to connect.
Yes, for me too. And everyone, the book is terrific, called Madwoman.
Thank
Thank you for
you.
writing it.
Thank you so much for reading it. It means the world to me.
So, Chelsea, before we go, where can readers find you?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram at Chelsea Bieker, Bieker, and then chelseabieker.com. And I also run an online writing platform for writers. It's this really beautiful community space with a library of courses and audio visualizations. And I do this with my really great friend, Kimberly King Parsons, who's also an amazing writer. It's called The Fountain, and we're at fountainpractice.com or The Fountain Practice on Instagram.
Well, thank you so much, Chelsea, for being here. It was a wonderful opportunity to get to know you, and I really appreciate it. And thank you, listeners, for being a part of it too.